viral story that came out. There's a Swedish company. They've made a chip that they want to insert into people's hands or any part of their bodies. And this chip will have data stored about you. And part of this is they want to use it for these COVID passports, these vaccine passports. I'm curious if you see this fitting into this whole technocracy agenda.
Well, the chip business is serious enough, and there haven't been a lot of countries adopt this yet, but it makes it a little bit too easy to see what's going on in other areas of surveillance and identification of people. And as it is right now, the ability of governments and intel organizations to identify and surveil people is just way beyond what the public understands. You can be identified by your face, by your gait, by your iris, by your heartbeat, which can be monitored remotely. There are just probably a dozen different ways to uniquely identify every human. Your speech, of course, your voice is unique. Your fingerprints are unique. Governments and intel agencies have perfected ways to identify people. And of course, with the addition of things like blockchain technology and massive database and artificial intelligence technologies, everything about you is known once you're identified. That information exists now in the ethosphere. It's been being collected for a couple of decades, and now it's just on steroids. They don't really need a chip to figure out whether you have a vaccine passport or not. But for people who are just kind of getting into this now, when they see the concept, oh, it's a chip, all of a sudden that you can understand that, you can click with that that's it. But it's much deeper than just a chip, believe me.
Well, and that's interesting. You're talking, of course, about all the different surveillance systems and tools behind it that can uniquely identify an individual anyways. The chip basically being also an identifying, item of some kind you insert into your body. But you're saying they don't even need that. The technology is already beyond that point. Explain this.
It really is beyond it. And your DNA is another aspect of this, by the way. That's the final arbiter of who you are. If everything else failed, and some people do seem to have twins, not real twins, but somebody said, I saw you on the street the other day. He said, it wasn't me, but sure looked like you. But by and large, I think the digital accuracy now of identifying people is probably up around 99.5%. And that's as good as any chip for sure. And I think probably China has been as good as an example of anybody who have kind of perfected this surveillance thing with one camera for every 2 or 2.5 people now in China. You can't go out of your house without being correctly identified. And, if they want to find you, for instance, they can find you within seconds, if not minutes. And all of your history is waiting for your identification in their master database. It's used for social credit scoring and all kinds of other things. But the matching up of your data with your identity is proven, I think, in China that, they can get you whether you have a chip in your hand or not. Now, if a chip would serve any purpose at all, it would be one of manipulation and control, just to remind people, if they have the chip, to remind them, yes, we know where you are and we know everything about you. But they could probably do that just as easily with some other type of a wearable technology too, or maybe a little tattoo on your hand or something, or maybe just a letter in the email. We're watching you.
Well, I want to get into some of the new technologies we see emerging. I want to get into Meta and Facebook and the issues we're seeing around that, especially with the new censorship we're seeing out of Facebook. But I want to step that back a bit and talk a bit more about technocracy, because, you've been at the forefront of this. And I think the world is starting to kind of wake up to this. China, in a funny way, it has really shown people where society could head. where they have the social credit system, 2 cameras for every person, as you mentioned, maybe more if you include smartphones and such. But people are starting to see that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to export those technologies. Some other countries are adopting them. And this is basically a communist society combined with the powers of high technology that can enforce tyranny through, in ways that I think even Orwell couldn't have imagined. And so stepping back, tell us, how does this fit into technocracy, and what is technocracy?
In the simplest terms, and this is their own concept dating back to the 1930s, technocracy is the science of social engineering. That science didn't really exist back then, but the theory was there that society could be engineered. They called it a science, but it really isn't a science, it's a pseudoscience. But the idea was to take control of all of the actions of people in society and direct them in a way that's favorable to the ones doing the directing, not your choice, but their choice. Social engineering is a phrase that ought to set hair on fire right now, because it's like people don't like to be socially engineered. Once they catch on to it, it's like they dig their heels in like the stubborn mule and say, hey, you're not going to socially engineer me. But we can see this now constantly all over the world. China is a great example, social engineering. You can't move left, right, up, down, sideways, nothing without being told what you can and cannot do. It's just incredible. And of course, the Chinese people have figured out some ways around it, but they're still captured by the system and they can't get out. They can't even leave the country if they want to, by and large.
So tell us, how does social engineering work with this? And then I want to talk about the agenda too, like who the individuals were who did this. But what does social engineering mean when applied to politics? Like what is the actual intention behind social engineering?
Well, here's a good example. Let's take Google, for example. I think a lot of people probably heard the interviews during the last election cycle about, I believe it was the CEO or the editor-in-chief of Reason. Was it not Reason magazine? I forget which magazine it was, but he was talking about Google. Oh, it was Psychology Today or something like that. He's talking about how Google was able to use its search engine capabilities to direct people to certain memes. In other words, when you start typing in a message or a search term or phrase into their search box, you have a little drop down that appears with all of the choices of which you think are other people's search terms, right? That's what I want. You click on it and you get something you didn't expect. Well, the theory was, and it was a very valid theory, that enough people could be manipulated by giving them selective information to cause them to vote a certain way that they might not have otherwise voted. That's social engineering. It's tricking people into adopting a position that causes them to take action that is a false action according to their own, say sovereign will, if you will. If they had not been through that process with Google, they would not have ended up taking the action that they took. That is social engineering.
So in other words, it's like you think you're working on an organic system, that you're just kind of crawling through the web of information, as people tend to think of the internet. But in reality, you're following a planned out linear thread that is intentionally leading you to what they want to lead you towards. Is that it?
That's exactly right. And there's a deep science behind this. We can barely scratch the surface of it here, but it's very closely related to propaganda, certainly. But the effectiveness of it is that it only works when you don't see it working. It has to cloak itself. It can't. If you're aware of it happening, you won't be nearly as bought into it or soft towards it. So they have to present social engineering in such a way that the target does not perceive that he's being socially engineered. And I have to say, the technologists, the technocrats of the world have really reduced this to a fine science. And we see this all over the world. It's not just an American issue. This is a global issue, and it's not just Google. There's plenty of other companies doing the same thing. Alibaba, Tencent, TikTok, Facebook. They're all global organizations, right? And they're all masters at social engineering at this point, and people are just suckered into it every day.